All right, people, you know that sound. It is the Unfiltered Band. Means, yes, another episode of Unfiltered coming your way. This one will go down officially. Episode 179. Met-centric today with the season opening, and always a topic for every team, no matter who you root for. Who will be the godsends, the unsung heroes? The lists at Unfiltered return. The top 10 unsung heroes in the history of the METS. Right? Here, and spelling, because reading is fundamental. And welcome, and thank you fundamentally for being on board the Unfiltered Revolution. You can get on board on Twitter, at Casey Stern, jump into the bio, get on the YouTube channel, and of course, most of you where you are on Apple, Spotify, and everywhere, iTunes, where you get your podcasts. We, of course, myself and my good friend back on the program, helping us with these Mets lists, because he is a historian and I am the other guy. That's Brian Wright. You can get it at Brian Wright 86, author of New York Mets All-Time All-Stars, Mets in Tens, freelancer at my old stomping grounds at MLB.com, and a historian for Mets Verizon who do a terrific job. Brian, good to have you back on the program. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well, Casey. Hope you're doing well, too.
I am doing well. I'm looking forward to debating what seems to be, and these are the best in doing talk radio for many years. These are the best talk radio type topics because there is no, hey, this guy's war is better than that guy, because we're talking about unsung heroes and you're dealing with where they stood in the test of time, where they were needed for their team, how they have kind of lived on beyond their years, what moments they had. Really, this is as much a kind of throw it at the board and debate it as you could possibly have, because there's no right answer either way here.
Yeah, this is a very objective list. It's like anyone could have a number. Any of these 1 through 10 could be number one, or could be number 10. It's in fact, it's almost like just a 10 that we chose. It's not. It's even hard to rank these. So to each their own, and I think all of these at least qualify as unsung heroes, and how you judge an unsung hero is really up to you.
And look, Mets are going to need it this year. Certainly, first of all, every team needs it every year. You never know who it's going to be. You never know when it's going to be. I don't want to bring up, World Series, the Royals, everybody remembers the Hosmer and all that stuff. Christian Colon had his first hit of the postseason in the most important time. We all remember, Cabrera and Sid Bream play with the Braves many, many years ago. You think about how many times guys step up in spots where they're in the bullpen, but they're a starter, or they're coming in and they're having that performance of their life. They're not expected ... to be there during seasons where guys come up and they play and they have, in the NBA, you would say play big minutes, right? That they're not expected to play. And you have that every single year. You don't often know what those questions are going to be that you need answered when the season begins. And because of what the situation is with Edwin Diaz and the importance of Edwin Diaz, which is why he signs a $100 million deal, and him going out, we know right off the bat that everybody going to move on down, because whether it's Robertson or Ottavino, then the Raley's, and you go on backwards. Now, during the season, you're talking about from the back end of the rotation where the Petersons are, the McGill who gets sent down, who will be back up at some point. That depth now much more into play right off the bat for the Mets heading into the season. Without even starting the season, you lost one of your best players already.
Yeah, the bullpen comes into immediate focus for obvious reasons. And the bullpen is the most unknown of all the areas on the team. You just never know who steps up. You never know who regresses. Edwin Diaz is a perfect test case, because we all thought how fantastic he was in Seattle when he came over. In 2019 was a disaster. 2020 wasn't that much better, and then he slowly improved, and then 2022 was historic. So I'm not saying anyone's going to turn to Edwin Diaz this year. That's highly, highly unlikely and almost impossible to do. But there's a possibility that someone in the minors, who was in the minors last year, steps up. There's a possibility that David Robertson becomes the closer. It's also very likely that someone gets traded, or someone is brought in from elsewhere to become the closer. So this is an area that naturally is the area where someone really does step up or regress. And that's going to really have to be the case here. And I think, we always hear in these previews, oh, look at this team, look at that team. If there are no injuries, there are always going to be injuries. This is what's ridiculous about when people talk about starting staffs and rotations and going well, if they go the whole season without injuries, well, they're going to. And that's why you build up that pitching depth. That's why you have David Peterson, Tyler McGill, people like that.
I remember, look, There are times I remember actually being at Dodger camp many, many years ago, talking to Ned Coletti. They had like 8 starters. There was a week before the season, and the day I was at camp, and this is how long ago it was. Billingsley, Ted Lilly were two of the names. So this is I don't even know how many years ago. But they lost 3 guys in a day. I mean, as soon as you say we got too much depth, all of a sudden it's gone. For the Mets, you got to think of it this way. I've seen, and we've had recently scenarios where teams have thought we're done before the year because of an injury, and all of a sudden it's far from it. Adam Wainwright was gone before a season. Cardinals thought they were done, and he was all the way. Now they didn't win the World Series, but they got all the way to the World Series, and he was their biggest cheerleader. When they weren't the Guardians, they were the Indians. Michael Brantley was the easiest, best player at the time, pre Jose Ramirez being Jose Ramirez on that team. He was gone. He was their biggest cheerleader in the playoffs. They go all the way and make it to the World Series. These things happen. And for the Mets, they're going to need guys to step up. So, seemed like the right topic. Let's be positive. Let's talk about 10 of these great stories. This is hearkening back not to ones that make us crazy or not any situations that make us feel dull and down, but situations that make us feel good. Like, for example, the fact that, as always, we're presented by our good friends at BetOnline. BetOnline remains your best source for all your college basketball betting this season. Get analysis of every play, every prop, and every point at BetOnline. Latest odds, bracket, contest, team matchup, and game trends at BetOnline. Updated odds for everything from live games to conference championships right through to the Final Four of the championship game. BetOnline, your college basketball headquarters this season. Head over to the website today. Use your mobile device to join and sign up and receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Be sure to use the promo code BELIEVE, that's BLEAV, to receive your bonus. BetOnline.ag, that's BetOnline.ag, where the game starts as we get started here. And at number 10 on our list of the Unsung Heroes, Jose Valentin. And one of our favorite teams that we've discussed going back to 2006 and that run that team was on, they had a lot of unsung heroes, but I would argue this guy doesn't get talked about still enough for what he did, becoming a cog who offensively had some huge games down the stretch and into the playoffs and in the postseason as well, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, I did not realize this was his second to last season in the majors. This was his age 36 season, and he played in the 2007 season, only played 51 games. So this was really his last significant season. He had played before with the White Sox, with the Milwaukee Brewers, I think the year before with the Dodgers. So, and he was not the opening day starter. Anderson Hernandez was the opening day starter at second base. And I don't know at what point he became, Jose Valentin became the regular starter, but it was pretty obvious why. And as you had pointed out, numbers, you really can't be like, oh, look at this guy's OPS or their WAR or something like that. It's really, it's more of just like the eye test, I guess. And, there are a lot of veterans on this team, but he was definitely one of them that brought the veteran presence. And, when I think of Jose Valentin's specific game, I think of the division clincher. I think he hit 2 home runs in that game. And that was, one of the big game offensive performances that you were talking about.
Traxel, so he really 6-0 against the Marlins, right? If I recall, my guy Cliffy with the catch in left field to end it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, he really supplanted. He took over that second base spot and held it throughout the rest of the season into the postseason.
Yeah, Valentin to me was. Look, you're down towards the bottom of the order. He hit 6th or 7th. But here's a guy who had some pop. I don't have it in front of me. He hit 17, 20 home runs somewhere around there that year, right?
18.
Right in the middle. There you
18.
go. Yep. But, look, provided some pop. He was, to your point, a presence. And it seemed like he was a guy who could come up clutch. Ironically, he and another name, which I think everybody knows is coming at some point, both ended up hitting at the bottom of an inning after a certain catch that was made with the strength to be here. And both of them with chances to really become unsung heroes or sung heroes, if you will, in that Game 7 against the Cardinals, and it doesn't work out. But Valentin, to me, belongs on that list. I thought he was one of those, again, subtle moves where a lot of bang for the buck that you paid, where you didn't get much, you didn't think you were getting much, but he ends up being your starter at second base every day. Really did a good job for them. At number 9, a guy who, to me, there are certain pitchers and there are others in the history of Mets time, like Chad Bradford, who come into this list, where the way they pitched is part of what you remember, not just how they pitched in terms of effectively. And certainly the mechanics of one Terry Leach fit into that mix in terms of pitching for the New York Mets.
Yeah, I don't know how many more submariners there are in Major League Baseball. I'm sure there are some. I'm trying to think of. Oh, there was a guy in the Marlins. Anyway, but yeah. So to set the scene for 1987, I mean, the pitching staff, which was so great in '86, I mean, maybe the greatest pitching staff in Mets history, became totally decimated. Dwight Gooden tested positive for cocaine at the beginning of the year. He was out for in rehab for 2 months. Bobby Ojeda went down. Sid Fernandez went down. And here comes Terry Leach, who had been with the Mets in 81 and 82, came back, was there in 85, pitched only 6 games in 86. He's in emergency is needed. Started 12 games that year in 87 and went 11-1. And I think he was unbeaten, if you want to, count this as a significant step, but we will. Went unbeaten for a good stretch. I mean, maybe like into late June or something like that, or maybe into July. So, I mean, he was really a godsend when the Mets really needed it. They were, falling way behind the Cardinals, and he kind of kept them afloat. And then the offense took over, and they almost caught the Cardinals, but came up just short. But without him, they wouldn't have been close.
Yeah, look, and to me, you go back to submarining, and he was almost a character in the way he pitched because his pitching had character.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, but sometimes when you have something happen where you think about Doc, my gosh, to have a guy step in, and there are a couple of other pitchers on this list that fit this category, where you're getting so much more than what you thought you were going to get. You don't need them to go win a Cy Young. You don't need the fact that they're fitting a way bigger role than they were supposed to is part of it. Now, sometimes it's just that they fit a role to a T, and that's the case in number 8, because Pedro Feliciano, who was the complement to Chad Bradford, who together, to me, look, you could think back to if you're, depending on the age of the fan, if you go back to late 90s, you think about Turk Wendell and Dennis Cook, right? They kind of won better that pair, if you will, a few years later, because I thought Bradford and Feliciano, they were as good a setup pairing as you had in the big leagues for at least a year or two. And Feliciano specifically against the Phillies, and what I always think about with Pedro Feliciano was how many times J.C. Romero, who I think got knocked for steroids at some point, ended up just mauling the Mets in the years where the Phillies beat the Mets. And we almost kind of won up the Phillies by throwing back at them a guy that they and nobody else seemed to find a way to hit. Feliciano was brilliant when he was at his best for the Mets as a setup man.
I mean, I just think about, coming in to face someone like a Ryan Howard. Like that would be the perfect time to use him, and they did. And, it worked out a lot. Because Ryan Howard at that time was hitting 50 home runs, and they could, the Mets had a guy who could thwart that. And we see like a lot of lefty specialists, of course, still, even with, the 3-batter rule, still have a lefty specialist, but he was, a lefty who was much more than that. I mean, he made 64 appearances in 2006 with a 2.09 ERA. 78 appearances in 2007, 86, 88, and then 92 the next 3 years, which led the league each year. So he wasn't just like, come in and face, Ryan Howard or come in and face, I don't know, name a guy on the Braves who is a left-hander. He was just a guy put out there and, pitch just about, it seems like, every other day when needed. Chad Bradford would also be out there, but you could definitely always count on Pedro Feliciano. Even when the Mets were kind of falling apart, he was still there.
Yeah, back in the days where I guess Brian McCann later at the end of the day, Brian McCann. But it's interesting because we always remember, and I think about a guy who wasn't unsung, but we talk about acquisitions. One of the other lists we did, Billy Wagner, and what he became. Part of where the Mets got exposed in that series in 2006 was having to use, it seemed like Willie Randolph, who I thought Willie got a raw deal, did a better job than people give him credit for. Mm-hmm. But his obsession with Guillermo Mota was something else. I mean, I don't even know how many times. Guillermo Mota, who was most known before that for the whole issue with Piazza when he was on the Dodgers in spring training. Guillermo Mota, I think he made an appearance even in games that he wasn't even appearing. It seemed like he was in every game because anytime that they went past Feliciano or Bradford or Wagner, they got into trouble. And, to me, Feliciano was so valuable. But to your point, they rode him like Seattle Slew. It was very much like Joe Torre used to use the Quantrills, and all these guys' arms fell off, and Scott Proctor and many others. Feliciano was a workhorse for the Mets. He sits at number 8. So number 10, Jose Valentin. Number 9, Terry Leach. Number 8, we've got Pedro Feliciano, and it's Tank at number 7. Todd Pratt, I was at the game where he hit the home run that Steve Finley, I forgot his name for a second, that Steve Finley couldn't catch against Arizona. And you think about the moments, the 2 moments that come out, there were plenty. Because Todd Pratt look, the Mets have had some very, again, character-driven backup catchers. Really, you could do a whole show on the backup catchers that the Mets have had. Ramon Castro, who kind of looked like Piston Honda at the end of Punch-Out. His head was a lot bigger than the rest of his body. And he had that voice at the very low voice. I mean, they've had some characters. But Todd Pratt's 2 moments probably did stand out among anything else. One, that home run clearly. The other one is not allowing Robin Ventura to get to second base during the Grand Slam single, which was a few days later. Todd Pratt had huge moments and became a fan favorite, but he was a fan favorite even before that moment, Brian, because it did seem like even during the year when he would come in, he was always a guy on the days where he would play, where he may go 1 for 10, but that one was always going to be a big knock for number 7, Todd Pratt.
Yeah, I think this was kind of the time when you realized you needed, 2 catchers. I don't want to say it's like you need, 2 running backs like in football, but Mike Piazza was, he was so valuable that you almost needed to protect him in some way. So his offense was so important that if he got nicked up, it was better, it might be a situation where you needed to protect him for like a day or two. So you needed a guy behind him just in case for that one day, one out of once a week to spell him. And Todd Pratt was that guy. And again, numbers aren't going to stand out. It's the moments, it's those big hits. It's, the 1999 playoffs. I remember drawing the walk in that game that before the Robin Ventura Grand Slam single that he caused, I guess. But I remember him drawing the walk that tied the game against the Braves in the 15th inning. But yeah, he is the definition of unsung. I mean, it was a pizza delivery guy and worked at Bucky Dent's baseball school for a year.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Was that a baseball for all of '96? He started with the Phillies and then went to the Cubs and then was out of baseball and comes back to the Mets. And he had 160 plate appearances in 1999 and 190 more in 2000. But yeah, it's just, you just remember, he's still a fan favorite. I'm trying to remember. I assume he was at Old Timers Day, and I'm assuming he still gets a lot of recognition.
He's still a fan favorite. He's still there are a couple of guys on our list. I would say him, number 4 that's on our list. There are a couple on our list that they'll get the biggest, to use the wrestling term, pops, because just how they were. Todd Pratt loved being a Met. I mean, he was a guy who was he was very much ringleader in the clubhouse, all the celebrations. He's the first one out, top step. I mean, he was in it, even if he wasn't playing every day. And you kind of admire that because they needed that. And during that time, I used to work with him at OV.com, but the late Darrell Hamilton, Lenny Harris, Todd Pratt, there were some really, really good character guys during those 99. Sean Dunston, when he came over, that was a really underrated part of that team, was how many veteran guys they had who had been everyday players playing big roles, playing smaller roles for them. Todd Pratt, a guy who is fitting and deserving on our list and fits in at his jersey number at number 7. The guy at number 6 wore 47, and I want to sit there. I almost want to, if the screen was big enough, do the whole thing he used to do in the batter's box. But I would just say this, in the lore of when Randy Johnson pitched against the Mets, there were 2 Randy Johnson killers. I jokingly say Dae-Sung Koo, who, if anybody has not seen, should go YouTube, his double, and then he scored from second on a bunt. It was an unbelievable inning in one of his only starts as a Met, but against Randy Johnson. But Joe McEwing, Super Joe, the Randy Johnson killer, which it became funny every time they would play against Arizona, he'd be in the lineup, or when he was on Houston against Randy Johnson, no matter like who was playing, he'd find a way in. He is probably the definition of a utility player before Brian, the utility player existed. I feel like in the time I covered the game, Ben Zobrist, I thought, was the beginning of the change of how that was used because he went from that guy to being an everyday player and then became a World Series hero for two different franchises. And that kind of changed things a bit. But to me, before that, Joe McEwing is one of the first real examples we had for, I don't know, you tell me how long, at least a decade, where for a number of teams, New York, St. Louis, everywhere he played, you literally could find him anywhere in a diamond pretty much behind other than behind the plate.
Yeah, I'm looking at his baseball reference, and in 1990, this is with St. Louis when he was a rookie. I mean, he was playing second base, he was playing left field, he was playing right field, center field. Yeah, it was at third base, everywhere but catcher and pitcher. You could find him, and the same thing with the Mets. I mean, I'm looking to see if maybe he even pitched or played
It's
behind the
not
plate.
he might have. I mean, but that's why he
I
has to
don't
get
know.
the Super Joe moniker because
Super
of that.
Joe, yeah. And he was, and it was just hilarious to see him going up against Randy Johnson. Randy Johnson, however, 6'10", and Joe McEwing, 5'10". I'm looking him up here, and yeah, would destroy him and drive Randy Johnson to a fury. I remember it was a game in like May of 2000 that he really owned him, in particular. But yeah, just a guy that you could plug him in anywhere and was the definition of, like, as you said, like you think Jeff McNeil plays a lot of positions: second base, third base, left field. I mean, Joe McEwing takes that and raises that up a notch.
And Jersey always dirty. Like from
Mm-hmm.
day, like he only knew one way to play. He was a gamer. I mean, he was a guy who was meant like
Yeah.
Joe McEwing probably should have been on the Red Sox. Like he was just one of these guys that, like, if you ever was a dirt dog, that was kind of the way he played. But it's why, and I think he's gonna be a very good manager someday. It's why he's become, I think he's up to a bench coach now. I mean, he's been a coach in the league for a long time. He's one of those dudes who really understood the game. Every manager loved him. Tony La Russa loved him. Which is why he ended up on that White Sox staff when he was back over there. But he was a great Met. I love Joe McEwing. 10, Jose Valentin. 9, Terry Leach. 8, Pedro Feliciano. 7, Todd Pratt. 6, Joe McEwing. And Al Weiss with 1S at number 5, who makes the list next. And he kind of splits kind of right between there's a lot of 2000s in here. And we go back a little bit old guard. Al Weiss at number 5.
Yeah, and we talk about Todd Pratt and the big moments. Al Weiss is purely for the 1969 World Series, in particular Game 5. Actually, the whole World Series, I think he batted over 400, but Game 5 in particular, hits a game-tying home run in the 7th inning. He had hit 2 home runs all season. They were both in one game at Wrigley Field. And so he had never hit a home run at Shea Stadium, and he winds up that day, Game 5 of the World Series, hitting his first home run all year at Shea Stadium. Pretty good timing. But yeah, tied the game, and then of course the rest is history, going on to win that Game 5-3. But that's really his moment. I mean, he comes over in the trade with the Chicago White Sox. That also includes Tommy Agee, and we all know what a hero Tommy Agee was in the World Series. So if we want to divert to like great trades, I think we brought that one up when we talked about great trades. But this was the payoff for Al Weiss, at least in the 69 World Series.
And when you're part of big moments, that's what happens is you get, whether you come in and you play a small role after a trade or not, it exponentially, look, the heroes of October, we see the commercial every year, but that's what happened. Our number 4 was, a hero seemingly from the day he stepped on the field. And then he had his real, because literally, and not a field here, because he was even a hero playing in Japan for the Mets, how all of that fits in. Because I remember watching at 3:00 in the morning when he had a game winner, when they opened the season over there. But everyone remembers Benny Agbayani, the home run against the Giants. I remember Benny Agbayani at number 4 for a lot of reasons, namely the Benny and the Mets, which was fantastic with the whole Elton John thing. But I remember I was sitting, it was on my birthday in 2000, when they ended up winning the NLCS to go to the World Series, and the game against the Cardinals, where they what is it? I think it was Game 5.
Yeah.
At left field, I was sitting up in the upper deck with my father and two of my friends. First of all, it was shaking, legitimately. Like everyone's always like every state. No, I mean it was. First of all, it's Shea, so it was old, but it was literally shaking. And Benny Agbayani running around like just celebrating out down by left field, and how beloved he had become, despite not knowing at times if there were three outs because he had some issues. He wasn't always perfect. Benny Agbayani got as loud a pop at Old Timers Day as seemingly anybody. And he wasn't on a team that won a World Series. He wasn't a heroic player. He was never the best player on the team. He took Sid's number. I mean, there was a lot not to love, but he's as lovable of a franchise guy who kind of did the most, I guess, with the least. And I hate saying it that way, but he wasn't the fastest. He wasn't the strongest. He kind of had a great story, and he became a fan favorite and beloved player very, very quickly.
Yeah, I think it was the story that everyone really gravitated to. And he was, there are a lot of 1999, late 90s, early 2000s Mets on here. And it's just because that was the team and the character of that team. I mean, you had Piazza and Alfonso and Al Leiter, but you had these components who would contribute. And Bobby Valentine loved these guys and really utilized them. And I think Benny Agbayani was the classic like Bobby Valentine project where he just like really had faith in him. And I think that game in Japan in 2000, if I remember, he was like on the verge of being sent to the minors. And Agbayani was like, I'd rather you trade me than send me to the minors because, you played several years in the minors. So, and then he hits the home run. Ricky Henderson does Ricky Henderson things. He's cut. Benny Agbayani has a spot on the roster. And then, then the rest of the 2000 season happens, forgets the outs, but he comes back. I think the game he forgot the outs was against the Giants, and then he comes back in the division series, hit that home run against the Giants. So really all comes full circle. And that really capped his popularity. That was like the apex of his popularity.
And he looked like an NFL fullback. Like he just like everything about him was huge smile, great charisma, lovable, was great with the crowd. Like very much again, love being Met fans love Mets who love being a Met. Starling Marte may only play for these 4 years with the Mets or whatever it is, but if he's healthy the whole time, 20 years from now, Met fans are going to remember him as a beloved guy, assuming he doesn't do some Timo Perez in the World Series at some point, because he loves being a Met. He loves New York. He's sucking up all of that, and Met fans love that. Like that is what they're about. And Benny Agbayani was all about all of that. It's why Cespedes became such a fan favorite so quickly, because they want to see you embracing New York and the spotlight. And Benny Agbayani loved being a New York Met. He pretty much was the antithesis in terms of energy of number 3, who pretty much was like a flat line, but that's why he pitched so well. It's also why no one remembers him except you and me, who have put him on, I don't know, every list. I mean, unless we start doing a list where guys couldn't have worn 30 or higher on their jersey, and he wore 35, I believe, then he would be ineligible. We may have Rick Reed on every list we've ever done, but Rick Reed is at number 3. And when you end up in a rotation where you're always behind a 1 and 2 that are supposed to be an ace or a pair of aces, right? You end up, he very much had a Chris Bassett kind of a feel to him, right? In terms of just deep into games, right? The first 2 guys may have all the flash, but I'll be the guys in the 6th or 7th inning over and give up 2 runs. Very much like the year Bassett had last year is kind of what Rick Reed was like every year. But I always remember him as much a model of consistency, Brian, during that time period as they probably had in any of those rotations during the years he was there.
Yeah, I think we need to have Rick Reed on this show. We
I
love him
know.
so much.
We need to find Rick Reed. I mean, nobody even knows. You don't hear much about. He wasn't at Old Timers Day. Was he invited? I guarantee you, he's the type who was invited and wanted no part of it. So it's Rick Reed.
He's from I'm looking at where he's from. He was born in West Virginia. I don't know if that was where he was from, but yeah, but
He's a
that's
replacement player. I mean, even when he came in, no one liked him because even his own teammates because of the way he came in. Think about that sell. Hey, I'm a I mean, nobody wanted a scab playing on the team, and he's the number 3 starter for how many years? Seemingly everyone around him changed on every other side, and he always was there in that 3 spot in the middle.
Yeah, you can really sell yourself to a team if you perform like he did. I mean, he won 16 games in 1998, had a 2.89 ERA in 97. That was his first year with the Mets. But yeah, if not for the player strike in 94, who knows where he would be. He was certainly, wouldn't be a New York Met and wouldn't be performing up to the level he did, where he was just, he was like Chris Bassett in that he went deep into games. He was not like Chris Bassett in the fact that he pitched quickly.
Yes.
So he went through games rather fast. But yeah, I remember those 97, 98, 2 big years, was an all-star in 98, was an all-star in 2001 as well. And pitched a lot of, important games. I remember the game in 99 against the Pirates, in which the Mets were 2 games, or maybe 1 game out, with 2 to play, and he pitched a complete game that kept the Mets in it. Of course, they went on to go to the 1-game playoff, but that was a hugely important game that was a must win in every sense. But yeah, I mean, I think he pitched in the 1 game the Mets won in the World Series as well. So you needed someone to pitch an important game. You had guys like Al Leiter, you had Mike Hampton in 2000, but Rick Reed was old reliable, to put it with, for lack of a better term.
They were always trying to find somebody flashier, and Rick Reed. Look, it's like, who gave him the nickname the poor man's Greg Maddux? Met fans, I think. I don't know who. I don't know. I don't think it was Tom Glavine, and I don't think it was John Smoltz. I don't think it was Bobby Cox, because he really wasn't great. He was maybe even a poor man's Mark Burley when you talk about the speed of the game and lacking the flash and all of that, in terms of what he did, but very much like Maddux, because he worked with a changeup specifically a lot, and he was a guy who did not throw very hard, but he really understood how to look. He was, pre-Bartolo Colon, he was a strike thrower. I mean, that's what he was, why he worked quickly. And he could pitch to contact. And at the time, when you've got the Ray Ordonez's, look, the Mets had the best defensive infield, obviously, in 1999. Ordonez would have a lot of, easy plays seemingly he'd screw up, but certainly shortstop position was held down during most of the Reed years by the guy that you'd want there, the best defender the Mets have ever had, play that position at shortstop. So Rick Reed, fitting on the list. We'll have him on any list. Eventually, we'll have him on the show. We'll have to find him. Jose Valentin at 10, Terry Leach at 9, Pedro Feliciano at 8, Todd Bryant at 7, Joe McEwing at 6, Al Weiss at 4, Benny Agbayani at 4, Rick Reed at 3, and at number 2, the man responsible for, and this is legitimate, in 19 years in press boxes, the only time I ever got caught cheering in a press box, which is a no-no. The only time it's ever happened to me, and I couldn't control it, and I screamed because I did not even understand what I was watching, was during that catch that Endy Chavez made on that ball that was hit by now Hall of Famer, congrats to Scott Rowland. In the 6th inning, I want to say, was it the 6th inning of that game? Oh, I think it was.
I think so.
Endy had a huge smile. He was the classic example of, if you play me every day, I will get exposed. But if you don't play me every day, and seemingly every time he played like his former teams, like the Nationals, he used to destroy. Anytime you would start him, he'd get 3 hits, steal a base. He always found a way to swing. And Carlos Delgado I've seen him joke in interviews about how Endy would swing at every high fastball trying to hit home runs, even though it didn't actually happen. But Endy would always get hits when he was in the game. And he was kind of that 4th outfielder who Met fans would call FAN every year saying, why isn't this guy playing every day? And then you'd realize when he played for 2 weeks straight, it's time for whoever was really playing to get back in there. And then he had the moment and the catch and the strength to be here. And, we may unfairly have him too high on the list. Maybe because of that, maybe not. But Andy Chavez had one of the greatest moments in the history of the New York Mets that could have been greater because he came to the plate with runners on base in the bottom of that inning. And I always say the same thing, and I've said it to you before. He gets a double in the gap. I think it was first and third, maybe. It was one out. He gets a double in the gap. Him and Valentin both batted that inning. If he drives in a run and we don't have Howman and Molina, Andy Chavez would be an even bigger hero than he is already, but still beloved. And of course, most of it because of that catch in 2006.
I mean, he would have been the first statue. I mean, you would have built. I mean, we would. I don't know, but fans would have created one. I don't know. But yeah, he was a guy that you had to use in spurts. Like, sometimes fans don't realize that, like, as you mentioned, if you play someone every day, they're not as effective as if you play them, sparingly and at certain points. They're better utilized there. And Andy Chavez was a great example. Jose Reyes was, the spark plug definition. He was that, but Andy Chavez was, also that. So therefore he kind of gets overshadowed in terms of what he meant to the team. And he certainly fits that distinction from 2006 to 2008. Chavez brought his own kind of energy, like off the bench and on outfield, defensively in the outfield, whether it was that catch or, just playing out there whenever needed as a replacement. It certainly helps with everyone on this list to be on a good team, because if you contribute, it means more to the overall cause. But he is another one that's like, his numbers are nothing to, go, oh my goodness, but you don't need numbers for Andy Chavez to show his impact. Obviously the catch, which is like, is still one of the great moments, would have just been out, gone through the stratosphere if they had won that game. But there was a play, or there was a game, I remember, he walked off a game against Colorado with this just ridiculous drag bunt. That's like that's the forgotten Andy Chavez moment. I think it was 2008, 2007. It was after the catch, but that's another Andy Chavez moment I remember.
He, if we use the Rick Reed is a very poor man's Greg Maddux, Andy Chavez was a very poor man's Shane Victorino. At like his height in like for a week, he looked like he was a great defender in center. I know he made the catch in left, but Andy was a terrific center fielder, and usually was the best defender that the Mets had in the outfield, even though he wasn't playing every day, which is why he'd find himself in as a defensive replacement, right? He had the speed to steal, although he was one of many Mets, now Brendan Nimmo the latest, that the Mets have always had guys who seemingly can run but don't. So it's never like he stole 40, 50 base. He could have. He had plenty of speed, and he had a little pop. But what Andy did was he gave them depth, and the depth of that team was one of the best things that it had going for it. I mean, we talked about Jose Valentin. When you think about Andy Chavez, there were a lot of guys. I mean, really, the 99-2000 version and 2006-2007, which I know we don't bring up because of what happened at the end, but for 95% of that season, those teams had a lot of guys who would step into roles and would find a way to make big plays. And a lot of them are on that list. When you think about the Benny Agbayanis and the Todd Pratts and the Andy Chavez and the Jose Valentin from both of those groups of teams. But at number one is a guy who ends up in the best rotation the team's ever had, ends up, out pitching the best pitchers that the team has had pitching together. Again, not Tom Seaver, not Jacob deGrom, not Pedro, although as a Met, he was not that anyway. But Dwight Gooden and Ron Darling were that 1-2 punch with that rotation that was the best rotation they had. But in 86, when it came down to it, Bob Ojeda pitched better than they did. And in big spots, he outpitched those guys. And it never gets remembered that way. Very much like the Braves had this same scenario. John Smoltz, almost in every spot, in the big spots, outpitched Glavine and Maddux. But he was John Smoltz. So everybody still remembers that. Bobby Ojeda at number one never seems to get remembered outside of he was part of it. Like it's him and Sid, right? And they're in kind of like a one group, right? And then here's Doc and what he did. But Bobby Ojeda was as good as it gets. And in that season, He outpitched everyone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you could make a case that he is not a, by definition or whatever definition you want to use, an unsung hero. But I think when you look back to how he was perceived when he came to the Mets, which was a back end starter, for third at best, fourth, fifth starter, coming over from the Boston Red Sox, you could not have conceived what he would do for the '86 team. He went 18-5. He had the best ERA, he had the best ERA plus, which was 140. And the big, you mentioned the outpitching Gooden, Darling, any other Mets pitchers, coming through in game 2 and the NLCS against Houston after losing the first game. In game 6, he gave up 3 runs, but hung on and allowed the Mets to come back in the 9th inning with three runs of their own, and then win in the 16th. Game 3 at Fenway Park, after the Mets dropped the first 2, he pitches a brilliant game. So he went from being like a middle of the rotation starter to being the ace in a sense. And I think because he, 87 he got hurt, 88 was good. Fortunately, got the terrible injury at the end of the season. Had a good Mets career. Some people might go, oh, not in Unsung Hero. But I think when you specifically look at 86 and what we thought he was going to be coming into that season, and how he was going to fit into the team, and maybe be behind the likes of Gooden and Darling, to rise up to the best pitcher on the best staff in Mets history, I think rightly puts him here at the top of the list.
What he was expected to do and what he did were far different. So even if he was expected to fill a role, people don't remember it to the way that they should, which is, no, he didn't have the talent. He didn't have the fastball and the curveball Dwight Gooden had, but he had a better season than Doc did. And he was the best they had to offer at the biggest times in a year that, to many, especially if you're sitting like me in my 40s, because I didn't live through 1969, was the best team that the Mets have ever had. And, that's hopefully until 2023, although that remains to be seen. We'll have more lists coming during the season and more coming at you as we get now just a few days away from opening day. As always, you can keep up with Brian at Brian Wright 86 on Twitter, and me at Casey Stern, and everywhere that you get the Unfiltered podcast and your Unfiltered Revolution, Apple, Spotify, everywhere else you get your podcast. As always, we here at Unfiltered thank you. We are presented by our good friends at BetOnline.